February 1st, 1943, above the Tunisian desert, 20,000 feet. The pencil scratched against the navigation chart as Lieutenant Harry C. Nuessel plotted their return course from Tunis, the numbers blurring slightly through the condensation on his oxygen mask. In 17 minutes, they would be beyond the range of German fighters. 17 minutes until relative safety. "Fighters! 12 o'clock high, coming in fast." The intercom crackled with the tail gunner's warning, but Nuessel barely had time to look up before he heard it, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not an explosion, not the familiar hammer of machine gun fire, but what he would later describe in a letter home as a distinctly audible swoosh, followed by a tremendous jar and a whoomp. Through the plexiglass nose cone of Boeing B-17F, All-American 3, Nuessel watched in stunned disbelief as pieces of a German Messerschmitt Bf-109 tumbled past, a wing here, chunks of fuselage there, the canopy with its iron cross clearly visible as it spiraled toward the desert 5 miles below. The fighter hadn't exploded. It hadn't been shot down in the conventional sense. It had physically collided with their bomber, and somehow, impossibly, they were still flying. What Lieutenant Harry C. Nuessel didn't know, what none of the 10 crew members could know in that moment, was that they had just become participants in one of the most documented and studied incidents in aviation history. Their B-17 was flying with its tail section nearly severed, connected to the fuselage by only a few metal spars and thin strips of aluminum skin. The photograph that would be taken of their aircraft in the next hour would become one of World War II's most iconic images, studied by engineers and pilots for decades to come. The mathematics of their survival defied every principle of aerodynamics. The physics said they should already be dead, spiraling in pieces toward the Sahara. Yet First Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson Bragg Jr., gripping the control yoke with the determination of a former Duke University halfback who had never lost a game in his legendary 1938 season, was somehow keeping 65,000 pounds of damaged aluminum in the air. This moment would trigger the most improbable survival story in the history of aerial warfare, a demonstration of American engineering and human determination that would force the German Luftwaffe to completely reconsider their assessment of the B-17 flying fortress. The engines coughed to life in the pre-dawn darkness of Biskra Airfield, Algeria, their right cyclone radials sending vibrations through the desert sand that had infiltrated every corner of the base. February 1st had arrived with unusual clarity. No sandstorms, minimal wind, visibility unlimited. Perfect bombing weather, as the operations officer had noted during the 0400 hours briefing. First Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson, Sonny Bragg Jr., ran his hands along the control surfaces of All-American 3 during his pre-flight inspection. At 25, Bragg carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had proven himself in multiple arenas. The newspapers back home in Savannah still talked about his performance with Duke's 1938 Iron Dukes, undefeated, unscored upon in regular season, the team that couldn't be beaten. That mental toughness, that refusal to accept defeat even when the odds seemed impossible, had served him well since he'd traded his football cleats for flight boots. The Boeing B-17F-5BO, serial number 4124406, had been Bragg's aircraft since August 24, 1942. He knew every rivet, every quirk, every sound she made. Built at Boeing's Seattle plant, she had crossed the Atlantic as part of Operation Bolero, the massive aerial reinforcement of the European theatre. The ground crew had painted her name in bold letters along the nose. All-American 3, the third aircraft to bear that hopeful name, her predecessors lost to the hazards of war. "She's running smooth as silk, Lieutenant," Technical Sergeant Joe C. James reported from his position at the flight engineers panel. James, who would also man the top turret once they reached enemy territory, had the mechanical intuition that separated good engineers from great ones. If James said the ship was ready, she was ready. The crew assembling that morning represented the peculiar democracy of the American war effort, men from vastly different backgrounds united by training and purpose. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel, Jr., came from a Connecticut banking family. The navigator, Harry C. Nuessel, had left his University of Minnesota engineering studies to join the Army Air Forces. The bombardier, Ralph Burbridge, had already earned his wings before Pearl Harbor, making him one of the most experienced men aboard, despite being only 23. The enlisted crew brought their own expertise. Radio operator Staff Sergeant Paul A. Galloway had mastered the temperamental liaison radios that connected bomber formations. The waist gunners, Staff Sergeant Michael Zuck and Sergeant Elton Conder, the latter a last-minute substitution from the 341st Squadron for an ill crew member, checked and rechecked their .50 caliber Brownings. And in the tail, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpolus, soon to earn the nickname Lonesome Sam, for reasons that would become horrifyingly clear, settled into his isolated position with the stoicism of a man who had accepted that he was the bomber's most vulnerable defender. The 97th Bombardment Group had been the first American heavy bomber unit to see combat in Europe, flying their initial mission from England on August 17, 1942. Since then, they had relocated to North Africa as part of Operation Torch, supporting the ground campaign to drive Axis forces from the continent. The group had already paid a heavy price. Aircraft and crews lost to fighters, flak, and the unforgiving mathematics of strategic bombing. Today's target represented a critical node in the German supply system, the port facilities at Tunis and Bizerte. Every ton of supplies that reached these ports extended Axis resistance in North Africa. Every successful bomb run brought the Allies closer to clearing the continent and opening the door to southern Europe. The formation assembled over the Mediterranean with the practiced precision of an aerial ballet. 12 B-17s of the 414th Bombardment Squadron formed into their defensive box pattern, a three-dimensional formation designed to maximize the overlapping fields of fire from their .50 caliber machine guns. All American 3 took her position on the right wing of the lead aircraft, Flaming Mamie, commanded by Major Robert Coulter, the squadron operations officer. The absence of fighter escort hung over the formation like a shadow. The P-38 Lightnings that should have been weaving protective patterns around them were grounded with mechanical issues. The B-17s would have to rely on their own guns and the theory of mutual protection that had yet to be truly tested against determined fighter opposition. At 20,000 feet, the temperature plummeted to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice formed on the windows, and the crew's breath froze inside their oxygen masks, requiring constant breaking away of ice crystals that could block airflow. The electrically heated flight suits, a marvel of American technology, fought a losing battle against the Arctic conditions at altitude. Men would return from missions with frostbite that rivaled their combat wounds. "Target in sight," Bombardier Ralph Burbridge announced over the intercom as Tunis materialized through the scattered clouds below. The port bristled with activity, ships unloading supplies, trains waiting on sidings, trucks streaming toward the front lines where the Africa Corps was making its last stand against Montgomery's 8th Army and Patton's 2nd Corps. The bomb run required absolute precision. For 3 minutes the aircraft had to fly straight and level, no evasive action, while Burbridge synchronized his Norden bomb sight with the target below. The secret device, which the Americans guarded so carefully that it was removed from aircraft after every mission, used a complex system of gyroscopes and mechanical calculations to determine the exact release point for the bombs. "Flak coming up," someone reported unnecessarily. Everyone could see the black puffs blossoming around them, each one representing hundreds of pieces of shrapnel seeking aluminum and flesh. The German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, originally designed as anti-tank weapons, had proven devastatingly effective against bombers. Each shell was fused to explode at a predetermined altitude, creating a box of death that bombers had to fly through. "Bombs away," Burbridge announced, and All American 3 lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosives fell from her bomb bay. Below, the port erupted in smoke and flame. Direct hits on the warehouses, secondary explosions from stored ammunition, ships listing at their moorings. A good strike, maybe their best yet. But the celebration was short-lived. As the formation turned west toward home, the fighters appeared. "Bandits! 2 o'clock high! Looks like 109s!" The warning came from multiple gunners simultaneously, as 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109G4 fighters dove from their perch in the sun. The German pilots had learned from hard experience that the B-17s' defensive fire was weakest from the front. The nose guns couldn't depress enough to hit fighters coming in low, and the top turret couldn't traverse fast enough to track a high-speed frontal approach. The first fighter, piloted by Oberleutnant Julius Meimberg of 11/JG2, temporarily attached to Jagdgeschwader 53 Pik Ass, Ace of Spades, opened fire at 500 yards. His 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns sparkled along his wings as he pumped rounds into Flaming Mamie. The lead bomber shuddered under the impact, pieces of aluminum peeling away like confetti. The second fighter, flown by Feldwebel Erich Patzia of 6/JG53, bore in on All American 3. Patzia was no novice. With 16 confirmed victories, he had earned the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, the honour goblet awarded to successful fighter pilots. He knew exactly where to aim: the cockpit to kill the pilots, the engines to cripple the bomber, the wing roots where the fuel tanks lived. But something went wrong. At 300 yards, Patzia began his escape manoeuvre, a half-roll that would take him under the bomber and out of the defensive fire. It was a move he had executed dozens of times. But this time, whether from overconfidence, target fixation, or a mechanical failure, he started the manoeuvre too late. Or perhaps, and here the historical record becomes crucial, he didn't start it at all because he was already dead. "I had him in my sights," Ralph Burbridge would later recall. "He was coming straight at us, and I could see his face through the windscreen." Then the top turret opened up. James had him too. The fighter jerked, like someone had yanked it with a string, and started this lazy roll to the right. Technical Sergeant Joe James, manning the twin .50 calibers in the top turret, had put a burst directly into the Bf-109's cockpit. At least one round, possibly more, had found Erich Patzia. Whether he died instantly or was merely incapacitated, the effect was the same. 2,000 pounds of fighter aircraft, travelling at over 350 miles per hour, was suddenly without conscious control. What happened next occurred in less than 2 seconds, but would be analysed for decades. The Bf-109, in its uncontrolled roll, sliced into All American 3, just aft of the waist gun positions. The German fighter's left wing cut through the bomber's fuselage like a sword through paper, creating a diagonal gash that ran from the base of the vertical stabilizer across to the left horizontal stabilizer, which was completely severed. Navigator Harry Newsell's contemporary account, written to his brother within days of the incident, provides the most visceral description. "The fighter hit us with a swoosh and a bang that shook the whole ship. I looked back through the companionway and couldn't believe what I saw. Daylight where there should have been airplane. The physics of the impact defied comprehension. The Bf-109's wing, travelling at a relative velocity of nearly 400 miles per hour, should have cut the B-17 completely in half. Instead, by mere chance, or what many crew members would later call divine intervention, the fighter's wing missed the main structural spars on the right side of the fuselage by inches. The tail section, containing Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpolus, remained attached by what investigators would later describe as the absolute minimum structural connection necessary to maintain any control authority. The German fighter disintegrated. Its wing, torn off by the impact, remained partially embedded in the B-17's fuselage. The engine and forward fuselage tumbled away in a ball of flame. The tail section, with its distinctive yellow nose and black crosses, spun like a maple seed toward the desert below. Inside that burning wreckage was Feldwebel Erich Patzier, born May 7, 1918, in Germany, who would be posthumously awarded his Ehrenpokal on March 1, 1943, never knowing that his death had created one of aviation's most remarkable survival stories. But the crew of All-American 3 had no time to contemplate the fate of their attacker. They had problems of their own, problems that, by all laws of physics and aerodynamics, should have been insurmountable. "Pilot to crew, check in. Everybody okay?" Bragg's voice over the intercom was steady, betraying none of the physical strain of wrestling with controls that had suddenly gone mushy and unresponsive. The control cables to the tail surfaces, the elevator and rudder that allowed the pilot to control the aircraft's pitch and direction, had been severed or severely damaged. The aircraft wanted to nose down, to enter what pilots called a graveyard spiral. One by one, the crew checked in. Miraculously, no one had been injured in the collision itself, but when it came time for the tail gunner to report, the intercom remained silent. "Sarpalus. Sam, you okay back there?" Still nothing. The interphone line to the tail position had been cut. But then, through the jagged hole in the fuselage, the waist gunners could see movement in the tail section. Sam Sarpalus was alive, trapped in a tail section that was moving independently from the rest of the aircraft, swaying with each air current like, as one crew member described it, a kite on a string in a hurricane. The full extent of the damage was staggering. The left horizontal stabilizer was completely gone, shorn off by the Bf-109's wing. The elevator on that side had vanished with it. The vertical stabilizer, the large upright tail surface, had a massive gash through its base. The fuselage itself was opened like a tin can from the tail gunner's position forward to just behind the waist gun windows. Control cables hung loose in the slipstream. Hydraulic fluid leaked from severed lines. Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth, navigator aboard the nearby B-17 flying flit gun, managed to maneuver close enough to take a photograph that would become one of the war's most famous images. In it, the tail section of All-American 3 is clearly offset from the normal alignment, canted at an angle that suggests imminent structural failure. The diagonal slash through the fuselage is visible, along with the missing stabilizer. The fact that the aircraft is maintaining level flight seems to violate fundamental laws of physics. "Jesus Christ," someone breathed over the intercom. "The whole back end is about to come off." Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. worked frantically with Bragg to find some combination of control inputs that would keep them airborne. With the traditional control surfaces compromised, they had to innovate. The autopilot system, connected to the Norden bomb site, used electrical servos rather than mechanical cables. By engaging it partially, they could provide some stability. Differential engine power, running the left engines at higher power than the right, could help counteract the tendency to yaw. But every input had to be gentle, measured. Too much force on any control, and the tail might simply tear away. "All-American," Major Coulter's voice crackled over the radio from Flaming Mamie, which had also been badly damaged in the fighter attack. "Can you make it home?" Bragg looked at the fuel gauges. No major fuel leaks, tanks still reading adequate reserves. Engines all running, temperatures and pressures normal, electrical systems functioning. The only thing wrong with the aircraft was that it was missing a significant portion of its structure, a minor detail, really. "We're going to try," Bragg responded. In the nearly severed tail section, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpalus faced a decision that would have paralyzed most men. He could stay where he was, hoping the tail would hold until landing, or he could attempt to crawl forward through the damaged fuselage to the relative safety of the main aircraft body. The tail section was moving independently, sometimes feet out of alignment with the rest of the aircraft. Each movement stressed the few remaining connections. Any sudden maneuver, any strong turbulence, and he would be riding 5 tons of aluminum to his death. Sarpalus made his choice. Gathering his chest parachute, his equipment, And, in a detail that would become legend, a borrowed jacket that belonged to Lieutenant Bragg, he began the most dangerous 30 feet he would ever travel. The scene inside the fuselage was apocalyptic. Daylight streamed through tears in the aluminum skin. Wind howled through the gaps, creating a maelstrom of loose equipment, spent shell casings, and debris from the German fighter. The fuselage floor, never designed to support weight without the surrounding structure, flexed dangerously under his hands and knees. One wrong move, one failure of the overstressed aluminum, and he would fall through into 5 miles of empty air. Waist gunner Michael Zook watched Sarpalus's approach with a combination of admiration and disbelief. He came crawling through that mess like it was a Sunday stroll, Zook would later recall. Calm as could be, dragging his gear behind him. When he finally made it to us, first thing he does is hand the lieutenant's jacket to me and say, "Make sure the skipper gets this back. He might need it when we land." The journey that should have taken seconds had taken nearly 10 minutes, but Sam Sarpalus had made it. All 10 crew members were now in the forward section of the aircraft, should they need to bail out. The bomber formation faced a terrible decision. Standard procedure dictated that damaged aircraft that couldn't keep pace should be left behind. They endangered the entire formation by forcing it to slow down and become more vulnerable to fighter attack. But the crews of the 414th Squadron weren't about to abandon all American 3. The formation closed ranks around the wounded bomber, creating a defensive shield with their massed firepower. It meant accepting greater risk for themselves, flying slower, maintaining formation longer, staying in enemy airspace precious minutes more than necessary. But these were men who had trained together, lived together in the harsh conditions of North African bases, and lost friends together. The arithmetic of survival took second place to loyalty. "All American, this is Red Leader," the formation commander radioed. "We're staying with you until you're clear of fighter range. Keep her steady." The German fighters, seeing the tight defensive formation and perhaps low on fuel and ammunition, eventually turned away. They had claimed their victories, or so they thought. Julius Meimberg, Erich Paxia's wingman, would survive the day despite suffering severe burns when defensive fire ignited his oxygen system. In his post-war memoir Feindberührung, Contact with the Enemy, he would claim a B-17 kill from this engagement. He was half right. Flaming Mamie would indeed go down, Major Coulter and 6 crew members killed, but all American 3 refused to die. As the formation finally crossed into Allied-controlled airspace, the other bombers began to peel away, waggling their wings in salute as they headed for Biskra. All American 3, flying at reduced speed to minimize stress on the damaged structure, would make the journey alone. The flight from the target area to Biskra airfield should have taken an hour. For all American 3 fighting to stay airborne, it would take 90 minutes that felt like 90 years. Every air pocket, every bit of turbulence, sent shudders through the aircraft that made the crew hold their breath. The tail section continued its independent movement, sometimes aligned with the fuselage, sometimes canted at angles that defied belief. Bragg and Engel developed a rhythm, a delicate dance with the dying aircraft. Gentle pressure on the yoke, never sudden movements. Adjust the throttles incrementally, feel the aircraft's response, adjust again. They flew more by instinct than by instruments, sensing through their hands and feet what the aircraft could tolerate. Flight engineer Joe James monitored the engines obsessively. Number 3 was running slightly hot, possibly from debris damage, but still within acceptable limits. Oil pressure steady on all 4. Fuel consumption actually improved due to their reduced speed. The Wright Cyclone radials, built in factories across America by workers who would never know how their precision saved lives, continued their steady thunder. "Navigator, how far to base?" Bragg asked. Harry Newessel had been continuously calculating and recalculating their position. The damage had affected the aircraft's trim, causing it to fly slightly sideways, what pilots called a crab. This affected both their speed and fuel consumption, but his calculations showed they would make it, albeit with minimal reserves. 40 minutes, skipper. Weather's still clear at base. Radio operator Paul Galloway had been in constant contact with Biskra Tower, updating them on the aircraft's condition. The base had mobilised every available emergency vehicle. Ambulances, fire trucks and crash crews lined the runway. The base commander himself had come to the tower to monitor the situation. The crew went through their landing preparation with mechanical precision, each man checking and rechecking their equipment. They kept their parachutes on. If the tail separated during landing, they might have seconds to evacuate. Waist gunners Zook and Konda cleared loose equipment that could become projectiles in a crash. Bombardier Burbridge secured the bomb site, still following protocol even in extremis. Unknown to the crew of All-American 3, their survival was already causing ripples through the German fighter community in North Africa. The pilots who had witnessed the collision were filing their reports, and the intelligence officers were struggling to explain what they had seen. The Luftwaffe had extensive experience with the B-17 Flying Fortress. They had been fighting them since the Americans entered the European Air War, and they thought they understood the bomber's capabilities and limitations. German technical analysis had determined that a B-17 required approximately 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells to ensure destruction. The aircraft's multiple redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust construction made it frustratingly difficult to bring down. But this, a B-17 flying with half its tail missing, was beyond their calculations. The initial reports were met with skepticism. Surely the pilots had been mistaken. Perhaps the bomber had crashed later, out of sight. No aircraft could survive such damage, yet the evidence was incontrovertible. Multiple pilots had witnessed All-American 3 flying in formation after the collision. Ground observers had tracked it on radar, maintaining altitude and heading long after it should have fallen from the sky. The incident would be added to a growing file of reports that forced the Luftwaffe to reconsider their tactical approach to attacking American heavy bombers. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most successful fighter aces and a key figure in Luftwaffe fighter tactics, would later write about the psychological impact of American bomber durability. To see a flying fortress continue flying with injuries that would have destroyed any other. Aircraft was deeply demoralizing to our young pilots. They would expend their ammunition, score what should have been killing hits, and watch the Americans fly home. Biskra Tower, this is All-American. 5 minutes out. Request straight-in approach, runway 27. All-American Biskra Tower. You're cleared for immediate approach, runway 27. Emergency vehicles standing by. How many wounded aboard? Bragg and Engel exchanged glances. By all rights, they should all be dead. Yet here they were, 10 men without a scratch among them, at least not from the collision. Tower, All-American. No wounded. Just need a straight approach. We've got structural damage. The understatement of the year. Through the windscreen, the brown expanse of Biskra airfield materialized from the desert haze. Home, safety solid ground. The most beautiful sight any of them had ever seen. Gear coming down, Engel announced, moving the lever. The landing gear was operated by a separate hydraulic system from the control surfaces, and to everyone's relief, they heard and felt the reassuring thunk of the wheels locking into position. 3 green lights on the panel. The gear was down and locked. Flaps? Engel asked. Bragg considered. Flaps would slow them down for landing, but would also change the airflow over the tail, potentially adding stress to the damaged structure. No flaps. We'll come in hot and use the whole runway. The approach required every ounce of skill Bragg had developed in hundreds of hours of flight training. The aircraft didn't want to fly straight. It wanted to yaw, to roll, to pitch down. Every correction required an opposite correction, a constant battle against aerodynamic forces that should have won 80 miles ago. 1 mile out, half a mile. The runway rushed up to meet them, wider and more welcome than any runway had ever been. Ground crews lined the taxiways, watching in stunned silence as the impossible aircraft made its final approach. Some would later say they could see daylight through the fuselage from a quarter-mile away. The main wheels kissed the sand-swept runway at 110 miles per hour, faster than normal but as gently as Bragg could manage. The aircraft settled, and for a moment it seemed the landing would be textbook perfect. Then physics reasserted itself. Without the tail wheel, which had been destroyed in the collision, the tail section dropped to the runway surface. The aircraft became a 65,000-pound sled, grinding down the runway in a shower of sparks and aluminum fragments. The sound was indescribable, metal on concrete, a shriek that could be heard miles away. Bragg and Engel stood on the brakes, fighting to keep the aircraft straight as it decelerated. Without the tail wheel and with compromised rudder control, any deviation from straight ahead could cause a ground loop, a violent rotation that would certainly tear the aircraft apart. 100 yards, 200, 300. The aircraft finally ground to a stop, sitting at an awkward angle with its tail on the runway and its nose pointed skyward. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, as if on signal, all 10 crew members scrambled for the exits. They assembled on the runway, looking back at their aircraft in disbelief. The damage was even worse than they had imagined. The tail section hung at an impossible angle, connected to the fuselage by what appeared to be strips of aluminum no thicker than heavy paper. How it had held together for 90 minutes of flight was beyond comprehension. "No business, Doc," Bragg told the flight surgeon, who rushed up with his medical team. "We're all fine. Not a scratch." The doctor looked from the crew to the aircraft and back again, his expression suggesting he was witnessing either a miracle or a mass hallucination. What happened next would become part of the legend, told and retold in ready rooms across the theatre. 3 ground crew members from another squadron, curious about the damage, climbed aboard All-American 3 to get a closer look. They made their way aft, peering through the gash in the fuselage, marvelling at the destruction. Their combined weight, perhaps 500 pounds, was the final straw. With a grinding, tearing sound of overstressed metal finally giving way, the tail section separated completely from the fuselage and collapsed onto the runway. The 3 airmen scrambled clear, white-faced and shaking, suddenly understanding just how close to death the aircrew had been for the past 90 minutes. Master Sergeant Hank Hyland, the crew chief responsible for All-American 3, walked slowly around the wreckage, taking notes on a clipboard. His job would be to determine if the aircraft could be repaired or should be written off as a total loss. It was a question that should have been academic. No aircraft this badly damaged could ever fly again. But this was 1943, and America was producing B-17 at a rate that seemed impossible to everyone except the Americans themselves. In Seattle, Burbank and Long Beach, workers were completing a new flying fortress every few hours. The production lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, staffed by men too old or too young for military service, and by women who had never seen the inside of a factory before Pearl Harbor. Hyland looked at the serial number painted on the tail, 41-24406. This aircraft had already survived more than any machine should be asked to endure. Perhaps she had one more miracle left in her. The conventional wisdom said All-American 3 was finished. The damage was too extensive, the structural integrity too compromised. In any other air force, she would have been cannibalized for spare parts and the remainder scrapped. But the United States Army Air Forces in 1943 operated on a different philosophy. If it could be fixed, it would be fixed. Master Sergeant Hyland and the men of the 50th Air Service Squadron spent 6 weeks performing what could only be described as major surgery. They found a tail section from another B-17 that had been damaged beyond repair in a landing accident. Using techniques more suited to a shipyard than an aircraft maintenance facility, they grafted the salvaged tail onto All-American 3. The work was meticulous and exhausting. Every rivet had to be perfect. Every control cable had to be properly tensioned. Every electrical connection had to be tested and retested. The men worked in the desert heat that could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit, then through the desert nights when the temperature would plummet toward freezing. They worked because every repaired aircraft meant one more bomber to strike at the enemy, one step closer to ending the war. The repair was crude by Boeing factory standards. The aircraft would never be the same. She would be slower, less responsive, prone to vibrations that hadn't existed before. But on May 10, 1943, All-American 3 flew again, carrying another crew on a mission to Sicily. The ground crews watched her take off with a mixture of pride and apprehension. They had brought her back from the dead, but would she hold together? She did. All-American 3 would continue flying missions, though relegated to less demanding roles: transport flights, training missions, milk runs to areas where fighter opposition was unlikely. She had earned the right to an easier life. On March 6, 1945, at Lucera Airfield in Italy, she was finally retired and salvaged, her war over at last. The research into the identity of the German pilot who collided with All-American 3 reveals a young man whose story intersected with history in the most violent way possible. Feldwebel Erich Paxier was 24 years old on February 1, 1943, just a year younger than Kendrick Bragg. Born on May 7, 1918, he had grown up in a Germany transformed by National Socialism, trained in glider clubs that were secretly preparing pilots for the Luftwaffe that wasn't supposed to exist under the Treaty of Versailles. By early 1943, Paxier had proven himself an exceptional fighter pilot. His 16 confirmed victories placed him among the successful but not legendary aces of the Luftwaffe, men who did their job with skill and professionalism, but whose names wouldn't be celebrated in propaganda broadcasts. He flew with 6/Jagdgeschwader 53 Pik-Ass, one of the most successful fighter wings in the Luftwaffe, credited with over 4,000 Allied aircraft destroyed during the war. The Bf-109 G4 he flew that day represented the latest evolution of Willy Messerschmitt's revolutionary fighter design. Powered by a Daimler-Benz DB605 engine producing 1,475 horsepower, armed with a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns in the nose, it was a formidable opponent for any Allied aircraft. In the hands of an experienced pilot like Paxier, it should have been more than a match for a lumbering B-17. But the calculus of aerial combat is unforgiving. One moment of inattention, one bullet in the wrong place, and experience becomes irrelevant. The burst from Technical Sergeant Joe James's twin .50 calibers found its mark, and Erich Paxier's war ended in an instant. His body was recovered from the wreckage of his fighter and buried at Borj Sedria German War Cemetery in Ben Arous, Tunisia, where it remains to this day. Plot 3, Row 8, Grave 15. On March 1, 1943, Paxier was posthumously awarded the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, the honour goblet that recognised his achievements as a fighter pilot. The citation made no mention of the collision, only noting that he had died in aerial combat against enemy bombers. His family would receive the traditional letter from his commanding officer, expressing regret and praising his service to the Reich. They would never know that their son's death had created one of the most remarkable survival stories in aviation history. The survival of All-American 3 became a case study for Boeing engineers and Army Air Force's technical analysts. How had an aircraft missing critical structural components managed to fly for 90 minutes? The answer lay in the revolutionary design philosophy that had created the B-17. Unlike previous bombers, which relied on a single main spar running through the wing and fuselage, the B-17 used a semi-monocoque construction. The strength came not from a single component, but from the entire structure working together. The aluminum skin itself carried loads, reinforced by frames and stringers that distributed stress throughout the airframe. When primary load paths failed, secondary and even tertiary paths could, under the right circumstances, carry enough load to maintain structural integrity. The key to All-American 3's survival was what hadn't been damaged. The wing-to-fuselage junction, the strongest point on the aircraft, remained intact. The main wing spars, carrying the weight of 4 engines and fuel tanks, were undamaged. The bomb bay area, with its robust construction necessary to carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance, provided a rigid box that held the forward and aft sections together, even when the connecting structure was compromised. Boeing engineer William Allen, reviewing the incident reports, noted that the B-17 had been designed with combat damage in mind from the beginning. "We knew these aircraft would take hits," he wrote in a technical memorandum. "We built in redundancy wherever possible. Multiple control cables, backup hydraulic systems, structural members that could carry loads even when their neighbours failed. The fact that this aircraft survived such extreme damage validates every extra pound of structure we included." The electrical system played a crucial role in the aircraft's survival. While the mechanical control cables were severed or damaged, the electrical wires running to the autopilot servos remained partially functional. This allowed Bragg and Engel to maintain some control authority through the Norden bombsite's autopilot system, a capability that hadn't been designed for this purpose, but proved invaluable in extremis. The survival of All-American 3 sent ripples through both Allied and Axis air forces. For American bomber crews, it became a morale-boosting legend told in briefing rooms from England to Italy. If All-American 3 could make it home with half her tail shot off, surely their damaged aircraft could make it too. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Crews flew with greater confidence, knowing their flying fortresses could absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft. The 414th Bombardment Squadron adopted a new emblem inspired by the incident: a puppy praying atop an aircraft's tail section, a reference to the phrase "coming in on a wing and a prayer." Though the famous song of that title was actually written about another aircraft, Thunderbird, the association with All-American 3 became permanent in squadron lore. For the Germans, the incident reinforced growing concerns about American industrial capability. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, responsible for Luftwaffe aircraft production, had already warned about the strategic implications of American bomber production. "The Americans are building bombers like we build cars," he told a conference of fighter commanders. "No, faster than we build cars. And these bombers are not fragile. They are flying tanks." The tactical implications were significant. Luftwaffe doctrine had assumed that catastrophic structural damage would destroy any bomber. Pilots were trained to aim for critical points, wing routes, cockpits, bomb bays, where a few well-placed cannon shells should prove fatal. But incidents like All-American 3 proved that even perfect shots might not bring down a B-17. Major Günther Rahl, who would become the third highest-scoring ace in history with 275 victories, wrote about the frustration of attacking B-17s. "You would attack, score hits, see pieces flying off, and watch the bomber continue flying. You would attack again, expend all your ammunition, and still it flew. Sometimes you wondered if American bombers were protected by supernatural forces." The Germans began developing new tactics, attacking from the front where defensive armament was weakest, concentrating multiple fighters on single bombers, and developing heavier weapons specifically for bomber destruction. The 30mm Mk-108 cannon, firing explosive shells that could blow metre-wide holes in bomber structures, was a direct response to the B-17's durability. The 10 men who survived the impossible flight of All-American 3 would carry the experience for the rest of their lives, each processing it in their own way. Their story, verified by contemporary documents and eyewitness accounts, stands as one of the most thoroughly documented incidents in World War II aviation history. First Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson Bragg Jr. would complete his tour of duty and return to the United States, where he served as an instructor pilot, teaching new bomber crews the skills that might one day save their lives. He rarely spoke about February 1st, 1943, even to his family. When pressed, he would simply say, "We were lucky. Good airplane, good crew, lucky." He died on October 13th, 1999, at the age of 81, taking with him the full measure of what it felt like to fly an aircraft that shouldn't have been flyable. Navigator Harry C. Newessel's letter home, written within days of the incident, provides our most contemporary account of the event. The letter, preserved with all 10 crew members' signatures, captures the immediate aftermath before time and retelling could alter the details. "I still can't believe we made it," he wrote. "When I looked back and saw daylight through the airplane, I thought we were finished." But Bragg and Engel kept her flying. I don't know how, but they did. Newessel would pass away on June 27, 1991, at age 74. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge became the crew's unofficial historian, spending decades correcting the myths that accumulated around their story. In interviews conducted near the end of his life, he systematically debunked the embellishments. No, they hadn't used parachute cords to hold the plane together. No, they hadn't completed their bomb run after the collision. It happened on the way home. No, they weren't headed for England, but back to their base in Algeria. Burbridge understood that the true story was remarkable enough without exaggeration. He died on February 3, 2013, at age 92, one of the last surviving witnesses to that day over Tunisia. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. returned to Connecticut after the war, rarely speaking of his military service. Those who knew him said he would sometimes unconsciously move his hands as if working aircraft controls, especially during thunderstorms. He lived until May 3, 2007, dying at age 92 with his family around him. Technical Sergeant Joe C. James, whose guns had killed Erich Patzia and precipitated the collision, struggled with the complexity of his role in the event. He had saved his crew by shooting down an attacking fighter, but that action had led to a collision that nearly killed them all. The paradox haunted him. "I did my job," he would say when asked. "That's all any of us did, our job." The waist gunners, Michael Zuck and Elton Conda, maintained that watching Sam Sarpolus crawl through the destroyed fuselage was the bravest thing they witnessed in the war. "We saw a lot of brave men do brave things," Zook said in a 1985 interview. "But Sam crawling through that mess, calm as could be, that was something special." Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpolus himself, Lonesome Sam, who had ridden the severed tail section, became something of a legend in the Army Air Forces. His matter-of-fact courage, exemplified by his concern for returning Bragg's jacket, represented the kind of unflappable determination that characterized the best of American aircrew. "What else was I going to do?" he said, when asked about his crawl through the damaged fuselage. "Sit there and wait to fall out of the sky? Better to die trying than die waiting." Radio operator Paul Galloway would note that maintaining communication with the base during the return flight was one of the hardest things he ever did. "Every time the plane lurched, I thought we were coming apart, but I kept transmitting our position, keeping my voice steady. If we went down, I wanted them to know where to find us." The photograph taken by Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth from Flying Flit Gun became one of World War II's most analysed images. Catalogued as US Air Force Photo 050524-F-01234, P-015, it shows All-American 3 in profile against the North African desert, the damage to her tail section clearly visible. The image would be studied by engineers, pilots, and historians for decades, each searching for clues to explain the impossible. What the photograph reveals is both devastating damage and improbable survival. The left horizontal stabilizer is completely gone. The vertical stabilizer shows a massive diagonal gash. The fuselage is opened from the tail gunner's position forward. Yet the aircraft maintains level flight, all 4 engines running, no sign of the imminent structural failure that physics demands should be occurring. The photograph has been frequently misattributed and misidentified over the years. It has been claimed to show the aircraft over the English Channel, escorted by P-51 Mustangs. It has been published with captions claiming it was taken from a German fighter. Some versions have been doctored to make the damage appear even more dramatic than it was. But the original authenticated photograph needs no embellishment. It captures a moment that shouldn't exist, an aircraft flying despite damage that exceeds all design tolerances, all safety margins, all reasonable expectations. It is visual proof of what 10 men achieved through skill, determination, and what many would call divine intervention. The incident of February 1st, 1943, occurred at a crucial juncture in the North African campaign. The Afrika Korps, once seemingly invincible under Erwin Rommel, was being squeezed between Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from the east and American forces pushing from the west. The port facilities at Tunis and Bizerte, the targets of that day's mission, were vital lifelines for Axis forces. Every successful bombing mission hastened the inevitable German surrender in North Africa. Within 3 months of all American III's miraculous return, Axis forces in North Africa would capitulate. On May 13, 1943, nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia, a defeat comparable to Stalingrad in its impact on German military capability. The bombers of the 97th Bombardment Group, including the repaired All-American III, had played their part in this victory. The B-17 Flying Fortress would go on to become the most iconic American bomber of World War II. Though the B-24 Liberator was produced in greater numbers and could carry a heavier bomb load farther, it was the B-17 that captured the public imagination. Its ability to absorb punishment and bring its crews home became legendary. By war's end, B-17s had dropped 640,036 tons of bombs on European targets, more than any other American aircraft. But the cost was staggering. Of the 12,731 B-17s produced, 4,735 were lost in combat. Each loss represented 10 young men who wouldn't come home. The survival rate for bomber crews was among the lowest in the military. Completion of a 25-mission tour, later raised to 35, was considered beating the odds. The miracle of All-American III stood in stark contrast to the brutal arithmetic of strategic bombing. Aviation engineers studying the All-American III incident have provided valuable insights into how the aircraft managed to survive. Analysis suggests that the aircraft was operating at the absolute margins of controllability. The centre of gravity had shifted dramatically aft due to the lost structure, putting the aircraft into a condition that would challenge even modern flight control systems. The key factors in the survival were structural redundancy. The B-17's design included multiple load paths for critical forces. When primary structures failed, secondary systems, never intended to carry full loads, managed to hold just enough to maintain basic integrity. Speed reduction. By immediately reducing airspeed, Bragg minimized the aerodynamic forces trying to tear the aircraft apart. Every mile per hour of speed reduction decreased the stress on the damaged structure exponentially. Gentle control inputs. Analysis shows that any aggressive control input would have exceeded the remaining structure's capability. Bragg and Engel's gentle, coordinated control movements kept forces within survivable limits. Weight distribution. The crew's movement forward from the tail section actually helped by shifting the centre of gravity forward, partially compensating for the lost tail weight. Environmental factors. The relatively smooth air over the North African desert meant no severe turbulence to stress the damaged structure. Had they encountered a thunderstorm or severe turbulence, the aircraft would not have survived. The engineering community continues to study this incident as an example of how robust design and skilled piloting can combine to achieve seemingly impossible outcomes. The lessons learned from All-American III influenced post-war aircraft design, particularly in areas of structural redundancy and battle damage tolerance. Research into Luftwaffe archives provides the German perspective on the incident. The loss of Erich Patzia was recorded in the war diary of JG-53 with typical German precision. Feldwebel Patzia failed to return from combat mission against American bomber formation. Witnessed colliding with enemy aircraft by Oberleutnant Meimberg. Aircraft and pilot lost. What the official records don't capture is the impact such incidents had on German fighter morale. Young pilots, many with less than 100 hours of flight time by 1943, were told that American bombers were easy targets, slow and vulnerable. Then they would attack these easy targets and watch them absorb incredible damage and keep flying. Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, who developed the head-on attack tactic that would become standard Luftwaffe doctrine against bomber formations, wrote, "The American bombers were not what we expected. We expected them to be like our own bombers, fragile, requiring fighter escort, vulnerable to determined attack. Instead, we found flying fortresses in the true sense, castles in the air that could defend themselves and survive damage that seemed impossible." The Luftwaffe began keeping detailed records of B-17 survivability, trying to determine weak points and optimal attack angles. Their studies showed that even when they achieved what should be catastrophic damage, B-17s had a disturbing tendency to make it home. This led to the development of increasingly heavy armament for fighter aircraft, culminating in rockets and 30mm cannons specifically designed for bomber destruction. At the Boeing plant in Seattle, news of all American 3's survival was met with quiet satisfaction. The engineers and workers who had designed and built aircraft 41-24406 had never met the men who flew her, but they felt a connection nonetheless. Every rivet driven, every wire connected, every system tested had contributed to bringing those 10 men home. The B-17 design had begun in 1934 when the US Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a multi-engine bomber. Boeing's Model 299, which would become the B-17, first flew on July 28, 1935. From the beginning, the design philosophy emphasized survivability, multiple engines so the aircraft could fly with one or two failed, redundant control systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, armour plating around critical components and crew positions. But the incident of All-American 3 exceeded even Boeing's expectations. The company would use the incident in training materials for new engineers, demonstrating the importance of redundancy and over-engineering. "Build it stronger than it needs to be" became an unofficial motto, because someday someone's life will depend on that extra strength. The production statistics of the B-17 program remain staggering even by today's standards. At peak production, Boeing, Douglas and Lockheed, Vega, were completing 16 B-17s every day. The workforce included thousands of women, Rosie the riveters, who had never worked in manufacturing before the war. Yet they achieved quality standards that would be challenging today with computer-controlled machinery. Over the decades, the story of All-American 3 has accumulated layers of myth and exaggeration. Various retellings have added dramatic elements that never occurred. The crew using parachute cords to hold the plane together, completing their bombing run after the collision, flying all the way to England, the tail gunner being rescued mid-flight. These embellishments, while dramatic, actually diminish the true achievement. The reality, verified by contemporary documents, crew testimony, and photographic evidence, needs no exaggeration. 10 men flew a catastrophically damaged aircraft 90 minutes and 150 miles to safety. They did it through skill, determination, and teamwork. They did it without losing a single crew member. They did it in an aircraft that had no business flying but somehow forgot to fall from the sky. Ralph Burbridge, the bombardier who spent his later years correcting the record, understood this. "The true story is amazing enough," he said in his final interview. "We don't need to make things up. What happened that day was impossible, but we did it anyway, That's the story that should be told. The 414th Bombardment Squadron would fly 178 combat missions during World War II, losing 85 aircraft and hundreds of aircrew. But no story from their combat record matched All-American 3 for sheer impossibility. The incident became part of squadron identity, a touchstone story that defined what they were capable of achieving. The squadron's new emblem, inspired by the incident, showed a puppy praying atop a tail section. The choice of a puppy rather than a more martial symbol reflected the youth of the aircrew. Most were in their early 20s, and their vulnerability in the face of enemy fighters and flak. Yet the praying attitude suggested both hope and the divine intervention many crew members genuinely believed had saved All-American 3. Veterans of the 414th would gather for reunions decades after the war, and inevitably someone would retell the story of February 1st, 1943. Men who had flown their own harrowing missions, who had their own stories of survival against the odds, would listen with respect to the tale of the bomber that refused to die. The German fighter forces' encounter with All-American 3 was part of a learning curve that would drive significant tactical and technical evolution throughout 1943. The Luftwaffe had begun the war with fighters optimized for dogfighting, light maneuverable aircraft with rifle-caliber machine guns adequate for downing other fighters. The appearance of heavy bombers forced a complete reconsideration. By mid-1943, partially in response to incidents like All-American 3, German fighters were being upgunned with heavier weapons. The Bf-10-9G6, introduced shortly after the Tunisia incident, carried a 30mm Mk108 cannon that fired explosive shells capable of blowing metre-wide holes in bomber structures. The FW-190 was modified to carry multiple 20mm cannons and even 210mm rockets specifically for bomber destruction. Major Walter Nowotny, who would become one of the Luftwaffe's most successful bomber interceptors with 258 victories, wrote about the evolution. Each month the American bombers seemed to get tougher. We would develop new tactics, new weapons, and they would counter with better defensive formations, better armour, longer-range escort fighters. It was a race we were slowly losing. The psychological impact on German pilots was significant. Young pilots, increasingly poorly trained as the war progressed, were told to press home attacks against bomber formations. But pressing home attacks against B-17s meant flying into converging streams of .50 caliber fire from multiple aircraft. The survival rate for German fighter pilots declined precipitously as 1943 progressed. The survival of All-American 3 was made possible not just by Boeing's design, but by an entire industrial ecosystem that supported the aircraft. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines were built in factories in New Jersey and Ohio. The 50 caliber machine guns came from facilities in Connecticut and Michigan. The aluminum skin was rolled in plants in Tennessee and Washington. The instruments were manufactured in dozens of specialized facilities across the country. This distributed production network meant that no single bombing raid, no single sabotage operation could significantly impact B-17 production. It also meant that improvements and modifications could be rapidly implemented across the production network. Lessons learned from combat damage were incorporated into new aircraft within weeks. The scale of American industrial mobilization remains difficult to comprehend. In 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps had 1,700 aircraft total. By 1945, American factories had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft. The B-17 program alone employed over 40,000 workers at Boeing's Seattle plant, working 3 shifts around the clock. Beyond the technical marvel and strategic implications, the story of All-American 3 is fundamentally about 10 young men facing impossible circumstances. They were not professional soldiers, but citizens who had answered their nation's call. Bragg had been a college athlete, Nuessel an engineering student. Burbridge had joined before Pearl Harbor simply because he wanted to fly. Their calm professionalism in the face of catastrophic damage speaks to the quality of American aircrew training. The Army Air Forces had created, from scratch, the largest aerial training program in history. By 1943, training bases scattered across America were producing 100,000 new pilots annually, along with similar numbers of navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and other aircrew. This training emphasized not just technical skills, but crew coordination and emergency procedures. Crews flew together through advanced training, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, developing the teamwork that would save lives in combat. The crew of All-American 3 had flown together for months, creating the mutual trust that allowed them to function effectively even when their aircraft was literally falling apart around them. While the survival of one bomber might seem tactically insignificant in a war involving thousands of aircraft, the strategic impact was considerable. The incident occurred during a critical period when American daylight bombing doctrine was being severely tested. The theory that heavily armed bombers could fight their way to targets without fighter escort was proving costly. But incidents like All-American 3 provided evidence that the B-17 could at least survive the journey home, even when severely damaged. This survivability meant that experienced crews were more likely to complete their tours, preserving institutional knowledge and improving overall effectiveness. It meant that damaged aircraft could be repaired and returned to service rather than being total losses. More importantly, it affected German strategic calculations. If American bombers were this difficult to destroy, and if American industry could produce them faster than Germany could shoot them down, then the mathematics of aerial attrition favoured the Allies. This realisation contributed to the gradual shift of German production priorities, from offensive to defensive weapons, from bombers to fighters, a shift that would ultimately prove futile. Despite extensive documentation, some aspects of All-American 3's survival remain subjects of engineering study. How did the few remaining structural members, designed to carry perhaps 20% of the loads they endured, hold together for 90 minutes? Why didn't aerodynamic flutter, the destructive vibration that can tear damaged aircraft apart, develop during the return flight? The aircraft appears to have been operating in what engineers call a non-linear regime, a condition where normal aerodynamic rules become unpredictable. The fact that the aircraft remained controllable in this regime may have been due to a fortunate combination of factors: the specific damage pattern, atmospheric conditions, and the skill of the pilots all aligning to create a survivable situation against overwhelming odds. In 1985, several surviving members of the crew gathered for a reunion in Austin, Texas. Age had silvered their hair and slowed their steps, but when they stood before a B-17 on static display, the years fell away. They walked through the aircraft, each remembering their position on that day 42 years earlier. Bragg, then 67, sat in the pilot's seat one more time, his hands automatically finding the control yoke. "She was a good ship," he said quietly. "She brought us home when she had every right to quit on us. You can't ask more than that from an airplane." Burbridge, standing in the bombardier's position in the nose, pointed through the plexiglass. "That's where I saw the fighter coming in. Right there, straight at us. I can still see his face sometimes, just before James got him." They signed autographs for aviation enthusiasts who had come to meet the men of All-American 3. They answered questions, posed for photographs, and shared memories. But there were also long silences, moments when each man was back over Tunisia, feeling the aircraft shudder from the impact, wondering if the next second would be their last. Military historians have placed the incident of All-American 3 within the broader context of the air war over Europe and North Africa. The incident exemplifies both the robustness of American bomber design and the courage of the young men who flew them. It demonstrates that survival in aerial combat often depended on a combination of good engineering, skilled piloting, and simple luck. The incident also influenced post-war aviation design. The concept of redundancy, of building aircraft that could survive battle damage, became central to military aircraft design. Modern combat aircraft incorporate lessons learned from B-17 combat experience, including multiple hydraulic systems, redundant flight controls, and structural designs that prevent catastrophic failure from localized damage. The statistics of all American 3's survival remain compelling. 90 minutes, flight time from collision to landing. 150 miles, distance flown with catastrophic damage. 20,000 feet, altitude at impact. 10 men, crew members who all survived uninjured. 0 feet, distance the tail section was effectively attached by. 6 weeks, time to repair and return to service. One photograph. That captured the impossible for history. 16 victories. Eric Patzier's combat record before the collision. 41-24406, the serial number that should have been on a loss report. These numbers tell a story of survival that shouldn't have been possible, yet was meticulously documented and verified. Today, only a handful of B-17s remain airworthy, maintained by dedicated organizations that keep the memory of the Flying Fortress alive. When these aircraft appear at air shows, elderly veterans and aviation enthusiasts gather to see them, to hear the distinctive sound of Wright Cyclone engines, to remember. The story of All American 3 is told at these gatherings, usually by someone who knew someone who was there, or who has studied the incident in detail. Young people listen with skepticism. Surely the story has been exaggerated. Then they see the photograph, read the crew testimonies, examine the technical reports. The skepticism turns to amazement. The aircraft herself is long gone, scrapped in 1945 after giving everything she had to give. But her story endures in museums, in books, in the memories of an ever-dwindling number of World War II veterans. She has become more than just an aircraft. She has become a symbol of American industrial capability, of aircrew courage, and of the sometimes inexplicable nature of survival in war. In his last interview before his death in 2013, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge was asked what message he wanted to leave about All American 3. He thought for a long moment before answering, "We were just doing our job." That's what people today need to understand. We weren't heroes. We were young men, far from home, doing a job that needed doing. The airplane was built by people doing their job, building the best bomber they could. When we got hit, everyone did their job. Kenny flew, the gunners watched for fighters, I helped navigate, Sam crawled out of the tail. The miracle wasn't that we survived. The miracle was that thousands of people, from the factory workers who built our plane to the ground crews who patched her up, all did their jobs well enough that when everything went wrong, we had a chance. That's the American way. Everyone doing their part, and sometimes, when you need it most, it all comes together and works. We flew home in an airplane that couldn't fly, landed a plane that couldn't land, and walked away from what should have been our grave. If that's not a miracle, I don't know what is. The story of All American 3 transcends the boundaries of a simple combat narrative. It represents a moment when the impossible became possible, when engineering excellence met human determination and created an outcome that still challenges our understanding of what aircraft can survive. The 10 men who flew home on February 1st, 1943, were carried not just by 4 Wright Cyclone engines and Boeing aluminum, but by the accumulated expertise of American industry, the training of the Army Air Forces, and perhaps something more, call it luck, fate, or divine intervention. Their survival proved that the B-17 Flying Fortress had earned its name not through propaganda, but through demonstrated capability. For the Germans who witnessed it, the incident was a glimpse of what they were truly fighting, not just American aircraft, but American industrial might, American training systems, and American determination. For a Luftwaffe already struggling with the mathematics of attrition, All American 3 was proof that the numbers would never add up in their favour. The photograph taken that day, a B-17 flying with its tail nearly severed, has become one of the iconic images of World War II. But it represents more than just one miraculous survival. It captures the essence of the American air campaign: damaged but still flying, wounded but still fighting, against all odds but still coming home. Kendrick Bragg and his crew didn't set out to make history on February 1st, 1943. They set out to bomb a target and return to base, just another mission in a war that seemed endless. But when disaster struck, when a dying German fighter sliced their aircraft nearly in half, they responded with the kind of quiet professionalism that characterized the best of the greatest generation. They didn't panic. They didn't give up. They simply did what needed to be done, each man at his position, each doing his job, trusting in their aircraft, their training, and each other. In doing so, they created a story that would outlive them all, a testament to what becomes possible when engineering excellence meets human courage. The Germans were shocked when they saw two aircraft become one, when fighter and bomber merged in a violent embrace that should have destroyed both. They were even more shocked when the American bomber, against every law of physics and probability, flew home. It was a preview of American industrial and military capability that would eventually overwhelm the Third Reich. All American 3 flew home on February 1st, 1943, carrying 10 men who should have died but didn't, in an aircraft that couldn't fly but did. She carried more than her crew. She carried proof that American bombers were tougher than anyone imagined, that American air crews were equal to any challenge, and that sometimes, in war's darkest moments, the impossible becomes possible. The tail section that finally fell off after landing, that couldn't support the weight of 3 curious ground crew members, had somehow supported itself in flight for 90 minutes. It remains one of aviation's enduring mysteries, a reminder that human courage and determination can sometimes overcome even the laws of physics. Today, when engineers study the incident, when historians document it, when veterans remember it, they all come to the same conclusion. This shouldn't have been possible. Yet the evidence is incontrovertible. The photographs, the testimonies, the official records all confirm that all American 3 flew home when she should have fallen from the sky. In that impossibility lies the true meaning of the story. It reminds us that in the extremity of human experience, when life and death hang in the balance, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. 10 young Americans, in a broken airplane over hostile territory, refused to accept defeat. In their refusal, in their determination to survive against impossible odds, they created a legend that will endure as long as people remember the Second World War. The Germans were shocked when 2 B-17s flew Piggyback, one dying, one damaged, but determined to survive. They witnessed American engineering at its finest, American airmanship at its best, and American determination at its most indomitable. They witnessed the impossible. And the impossible flew home.